Story 1. It's 100 years from now, and TLC has a new ghost investigation show. They are investigating my old place. The lead investigator says, "I've done some research and I think I know who the ghost is. Apparently, he was mentally ill." He holds up a picture of me and then proceeds to call out my name. That is exactly what they do in the present on these shows. Story 2. Because those individuals are old enough and their lives are distant enough from ours that we can romanticize them and create a stereotype. I would not be surprised if we saw more figures from the 1960s in another 50 to 100 years. Story 3. Fun answers only. You know what's fun? Understanding how and why such stories came to be. Based on my research, many homes from the Victorian era have either suffered some degree of decay or weren't built as well as they should have been in the first place. As a result, while the average visitor may never see a ghost, they might feel uneasy or notice strange electrical phenomena like flickering lights, cold spots, or unusual electrical signatures. This isn't due to haunting. It's because the wiring is faulty and the foundation is slightly unstable. The latter is particularly interesting. The human brain is very adept at detecting microtremors, which relates to how we evolved, specifically beginning to shelter and eventually live in caves. Do you feel uneasy in a cave? That's not due to poor construction. It's because the ground itself is moving, indicating that either an earthquake is imminent or the cave may collapse, neither of which is good for the people inside. It's a warning signal that is often misunderstood in houses with slightly faulty foundations. The bottom line is, bring in some workers to diagnose and repair what ails your historic building, and the sensation of, "Oh no, there are ghosts," will disappear. To me, that is far more enjoyable than imagining a translucent spirit floating through walls like some elusive particle. Story 4. It's never an 80s or 90s clubber who took too much ecstasy. It's never a 2000s obnoxious teen in wide-leg jeans who died while texting and driving. Story 5. It is because those individuals are most likely to have died in their homes rather than in a hospital. It was much more common to die at home in that era and in previous eras than in the last 50 years. Story 6. Imagine a ghost of Generation Alpha haunting a bathroom just to recreate the Skibbity toilet meme. Story 7. Probably the same reason why nobody claims to be a reincarnated medieval peasant but rather nobility, which is statistically improbable but more exciting. Story 8. In a past life, you worked for 6 months as a cashier at a hardware store. Story 9. Speak for yourself. I, for one, live in a haunted suburban neighborhood home. Once in a while, I hear the disembodied voice of a teenager singing. Story 10. I can't say there are any of those in Australia. I don't know what I have seen, but it wasn't human or alive. My mind led me to believe I saw my great-grandmother and my grandfather, and I often see my deceased cats. Story 11. Honestly, I believe that repeating hauntings, such as someone continuously walking down the same area of a hallway, resemble an echo in time. In that moment, something occurred that drastically altered the course of history. However, it takes time for those changes to become significant enough to create an echo. Story 12. I had my butt pinched twice by a ghost in our old haunted apartment. I consider myself a rational person, but that experience was exceptionally strange. Other events occurred, but I didn't see any reactions, so it could have happened at any time after the phenomenon of ghostly encounters. Story 13. The only time I felt a house was haunted was in a Quonset hut on the property, by a farmhand from the 1960s. Even my brother thought that place was haunted. We didn't see anything, but there was a feeling we didn't express. 25 years later, we compared notes and our feelings matched. However, Victorian ghosts are more classic, so that's what people claim to see. It's never a software developer from 1995. Story 14. There was a murder-suicide in my town about a decade ago. A banker was accused of embezzling a large sum of money, so he decided to kill his children and wife with a pipe and drive his car into an overpass. They lived in a nice suburban house built in the early 2000s. I am convinced that house is haunted. Story 15. After 100 years of roaming the earth as an intangible, invisible spirit, you get a second chance at the door to the afterlife that you rejected the first time. If you do not take that chance, you are bound to the earth where you are most likely at the point where you lived or where you died. That's why homes are not haunted by peaceful spirits until the 100 years are up. For us, the 1900s would be the most modern era. If you are vengeful at your death or have unfinished business, you don't wait 100 years. But that's when you need a priest or someone like Sam and Dean Winchester to help you on your way. Or hauntings are simply a bunch of nonsense, as proof of a ghost is worth a lot and would have been claimed by now. Story 16. Because imagination finds it easier to romanticize those eras. Since it's all imagination, that is what matters. Story 17. There are many humorous and culturally relevant comments here already, so I'll share a different perspective. I genuinely suspect that many of those so-called hauntings are psychogenic. I have friends whom I find logical and reputable who believe in ghosts. I cannot prove or disprove their existence, but I have provided guidance to people that focuses on severing and extinguishing self-created psychogenic entities, and they have noticed those so-called hauntings come to an end. Story 18. I can provide you with the real answer. It stems from parlor tricks in the 1800s. Scam artists and charlatans used to host haunted tours or seances, employing a trick known as Pepper's Ghost. Before this trick was invented, ghosts were thought to be solid and capable of physically interacting with the world. With the introduction of this trick, ghosts became depicted as transparent, often dressed in clothing from the Victorian era, and appearing as floating, non-corporeal beings. Story 19. My house wasn't built until the 1950s, so I have more modern spirits here. This is likely due to the fact that I have my in-laws and grandparents' ashes in the china cabinet. Story 20. I don't believe in ghosts, but most of the haunted houses where I live in the United Kingdom supposedly have ghosts from early medieval times, which was about the time when the population started to rise. Story 21. The short-lived Nickelodeon show The Haunted Hathaways featured a present-day ghost child. His origin was never revealed, as it was a children's show that was cancelled before they could find a way to pass the censors. It is often speculated that he was meant to have died in Hurricane Katrina. Story 22. I can see ghosts. They come from all walks of life. They are just as likely to be a garbage collector from the 1960s as a Victorian figure. In fact, more often than not, ghosts are people who do not realize they are dead. Eventually, most of them figure it out. However, that perspective may not be as intriguing, so people tend to embellish the story. Story 23. The famous stories are like that because they are the most interesting to the general public. My maternal grandmother died while my mother was pregnant with me. When I was a newborn, my mom swears she saw her mother walk past their bedroom door and into my nursery, then disappear standing next to my crib. It scared me when she told me, but my mom said her mother was just very excited to meet me and wanted to come back and say hello because she didn't get a chance while she was alive. I'm sure it was just my mom's sleep-deprived mind helping her deal with the loss, but that story means a lot to me. It probably doesn't resonate as strongly with anyone else like the story of a Revolutionary War soldier trapped in a loop because he died tragically does. Story 24. Coal heating and carbon monoxide buildup are implicated in many haunted house phenomena. This may explain why there is a specific time period associated with haunted house scenarios. Story 25. I believe I have the answer. I came across information on this topic some time ago. Apparently, before the late Victorian era, ghosts were envisioned as formless, invisible spirits, simply a presence. Then, during the Victorian era, stories emerged featuring illustrations of translucent apparitions, some depicted with the classic sheet over the body appearance and others as faint, see-through ghosts of individuals. This imagery persisted as later storytellers continued to portray the see-through Victorian ghost. As for Civil War or World War I ghosts, I'm not sure, but perhaps it is because in more modern times these ghosts, like their Victorian counterparts, are dressed in a conspicuous manner that makes them easily identifiable, much like in the past. Story 26. I had a conversation the other day. In the UK, it's about a Victorian small boy, a chimney sweep with torn clothes and soot on his face, a creepy Victorian girl in a fancy dress, a nun, a monk, and the Grey Lady. That's it. They must be super busy. Story 27. More people died at home in the past than do now. We also associate ghosts from those time periods as being scarier than a bank manager from the 1960s. Story 28. I lived in a small house in Seattle's Central District, probably built in the 1950s. I had an immediate sense of unease. My roommate felt the same way. We invited friends visiting from out of town, and they all shared our feelings. The bathroom was always 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house and had a disturbing atmosphere. One day, an elder from our street told us that a man had killed his wife in the bathtub and then took his own life by slashing himself in the tub. Story 29. The same reason that clothing does not become ghosts is because people need to wear cloth to become ghosts. It is all made up. Additionally, you never see a cow, bird, or any other animal ghosts. Story 30. My father died in 2004. He and I had a terrible relationship. In fact, we hated each other. On the day of the viewing, he came to my house. The viewing was from 2 to 4 p.m. and then from 7 to 9 p.m. When we returned home from the afternoon viewing, I found that the dining room chairs had been tossed into the family room. My wife suggested it was probably the dogs playing around, so I put them back in place. We confined the dogs to their crates before we went to the evening viewing. However, when we returned home, the chairs were once again in the living room. I had a priest come and bless the house to put an end to it. Story 31. There have been some theories that in older homes, residents experienced hauntings due to carbon monoxide. Toxicologist Albert Donne believes that chronic exposure to substances such as carbon monoxide, pesticide, and formaldehyde can lead to hallucinations of the type associated with haunted houses. Donne speculates on the connection between the prevalence of gas lamps during the Victorian era and the start of the 20th century, as well as stories of ghost sightings and hauntings, describing it as the haunted house syndrome. Donne says that carbon monoxide poisoning has been linked to haunted houses since at least the 1920s. He cites a 1921 journal article about a family who claimed hauntings because they suffered headaches, auditory hallucinations, fatigue, melancholy, and other symptoms which are also associated with carbon monoxide poisoning. In a modern example, Carrie Poppy, a writer and co-host of the podcast Oh No, Ross and Carrie, was convinced she was living in a haunted house. She felt she was being watched by a demon, experienced pressure on her chest, and had auditory hallucinations. Someone on a forum of skeptical paranormal investigators suggested she look into carbon monoxide poisoning. When the gas company arrived, unsafe levels of carbon monoxide were found. Story 32. In shows or in the actual endeavor of seeking proof of hauntings, there are no scientific methods for validating the existence of spirits or ghosts. Some seekers have even investigated hauntings associated with relatively recent deaths. Story 33. I think it all depends on how brutally or painfully a person perishes and how their anguish ties them to places. Medicine was not exactly a science during those times, so many people died in appalling conditions. It is not just the Victorian era and the Civil War era, though. Take Flight 401, for example. Story 34. Never been to Europe. Have you? Some castles here have ghost stories from the 12th century. There is a field in Italy where a Roman army was slain, and according to legend, the ghosts cry every night to lament the danger of their homeland. Story 35. Ghosts do not exist. Stories about hauntings date back mostly to the Victorian and Romantic eras, which is why many ghosts are associated with that period. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.